So welcome to Power Parsha Pearls, and this week we're going to be looking at the Torah portion of Mishpatim, which is the name of this week's Torah portion. And it's interesting to consider how essentially, last week we read about the giving of the Ten Commandments, and lest you think we committed to a mere 10 and nothing more, which I know arguably would be nice, the portion this week continues with a great deal more details and laws that were also given at Sinai and also are equally binding. But right in between, at the end of last week's Torah portion and the opening of this week's Torah portion, we find interjected in the middle of it all reference to specific laws appertaining to the altar, the making of an altar in the sanctuary. The discussion about the material, the tools, the prohibition against using metal, the ramp that was going to be used to access. How and why does an altar upon which sacrifices were brought feature in the middle of this all? What is the reason for this curious interjection in the middle of relaying the laws given at Sinai, the laws as they apply to all of us? I'm going to posit a theory over here. I think that in bringing in the altar in the middle of a discussion about the events at Sinai, the Torah is answering a question that has been asked from that all original Sinai moment when we were first proclaimed as a Jewish nation. And that is this: you stood at Sinai, you assumed a whole new identity, you were now formally proclaimed as Jews. Now what? What happens from this point? How do you define a good Jew? Is somebody who's going to adhere punctiliously to the laws but isn't a mensch a better Jew than one who is a nice guy but doesn't necessarily keep much? Is being a good Jew to be kind, to be honest, to be polite? That makes for a good person, but is it what makes a good Jew? What makes somebody a good lawyer? Is he a good lawyer if he can score a goal from 30 yards out? Or how about if he volunteers every Tuesday evening to serve dinner at the local soup kitchen? Is he then a good lawyer? Of course not. A good lawyer is someone who has a thorough understanding of the law and has the ability to argue and win cases. And so in our context as well, when we want to consider what constitutes a good Jew is a person chosen by God for a specific mission, to make this world holy, good, and godly. The Jew has very specific divine instructions on how to carry out that mission. Those instructions are found in the Torah and have been explained by Jewish sages throughout the ages. And therefore, a good Jew, by definition, is someone who treks through life looking to make a difference to his or her surroundings, to transform their slice of the universe, to fulfill the very mission with which they were tasked from that all initial point in time. But, and it's a big but, as we trek through life, we all have our areas of vulnerability. Somewhere along that journey, I might stumble or veer off direction. What happens at that moment? Does that mean that at that precise juncture, I'm no longer considered a good Jew? Well, the Pope met with his cardinals to discuss a proposal from the Israeli government. Your Holiness, says the cardinal, in light of the current rising anti-Semitism, Mr. Netanyahu thought it would be a great idea to challenge you to a game of golf, to show the friendship and ecumenical spirit shared by our mutual faiths. And the Pope thinks, what a great idea. I have one problem. We don't have a professional player in the Vatican. Is there anyone we know who could represent me as someone, against the leader of Israel? Well, there's this man named Jack Nicklaus. He's an American golfer who's a devout Catholic. We can ordain him, make him a cardinal, then ask him to play Prime Minister Netanyahu as your personal representative. And so in addition to showing our spirit of cooperation, we'll also be sure to win the match. Everybody agreed. What a great idea. The call was made. Of course, Nicklaus was honored and agreed to play. The day after the match, Nicholas reports to the Vatican to inform the Pope of the results. Your Holiness, this is Cardinal Nicholas. I have some good news and I have some bad news, said the world-class golfer. Well, tell me the good news first, Cardinal, said the Pope. Your Holiness, I don't like to brag, but even though I played some pretty terrific rounds of golf in my life, this was the best I've ever played by far. I must have been inspired from above. My drives were long and true. My irons were accurate, purposeful. My putting was perfect. With all due respect, my game was truly miraculous. The Pope says to him, so there's bad news? Well, he says, yeah, I lost to Rabbi Tiger Woods by 3 strokes. Life isn't about taking shortcuts, making compromises, trying to figure out how to circumvent the system to achieve my end goal. just to suddenly switch from one stature to another. Torah for the Jew is there to enable us to maximize our potential in accordance with our talents and abilities. And what is incumbent upon me is simply to know, honestly, in my own heart, that I maximized my potential, that I made an effort, that I exerted myself. I need to know, if nothing else, that I definitely gave it my best shot. That is paramount. Now, what is an altar? When we think about this for a second, what's the point and purpose of an altar? It's a place of sacrifice. The Talmud tells us that the altar, metaphorically speaking, would shed tears when there's a breakdown in relationships. I mean, why is that just poetic license? Why is the altar singled out? But the point is that the Talmud is emphasizing all too often our relationships break down on account of lack of sacrifice, when it becomes about what I can get out of it rather than what I'm prepared to put in. And similarly, in the context of our relationship with God, it's not a case of what can God do for me, but rather what can I do for God and the world he put me in. The altar is all about commitment, the giving of oneself, putting in your best efforts. Torah, for all of its intricate law and demanding observance, is acutely sensitive to the challenges and the obstacles that face every single one of us individually. And guess what? God is cool with your limitations. But as in any relationship, he wants to know that you're still giving it your best shot. That at times when there's a conflict between what you want and what he wants, you make the sacrifice. So God isn't going to ask you if you run a public company. He'll ask you if you made an effort to build a loving home and family. God isn't going to ask the size of your house. He's going to want to know about how many people you may have actually welcomed into your home. God isn't going to ask why you had so many questions. He'll ask whether you searched for the answers. God won't ask you why you called him when things were tough. He'll just ask if you thanked him when things were going well. God won't ask why you didn't succeed in solving the world's problems. He'll ask simply whether you cared for your fellow neighbor. He won't ask how beautiful you looked. He'll ask whether you look for the beauty in others. Every mitzvah is a fulfillment of the divine will, thus tapping into out of this world holiness and bringing it down to earth, doing what you can, again, to the best of your ability, thus linking creator with creation and revealing the essence of existence, such that you become one with another and you become one with God. That's what it's all about. So you want to know what defines a good Jew? Look at the altar, which God instructed cannot be made with anything metal, because metal is used for weaponry, destruction, and the altar is all about fostering peace and amity. Reflect on the fact that the altar was used to sacrifice to God, and that's something that we have to nurture in our lives as well. Sometimes reaching beyond our comfort zones and giving life your all, both in terms of our relationship with God and by direct extension with others. That's how you become a good Jew. Now, when reflecting on the laws in the portion, we come to discover that there are essentially two types of mitzvot. There are, apart from the testimonials, which are there to, of course, reflect on historical events, there are essentially statutes, or what you might call supra-rational principles, laws of kosher, not mixing wool and linen, etc. The Torah doesn't offer us any reason because they defy human comprehension. Ultimately, we do them because God says so. And then there are laws that are rational principles. Don't kill, help the needy, visit the sick. There too, the Torah offers no reason because there's no need to. They are perfectly obvious. But there's one exception to all these laws, and it is found in our Torah portion this week. The Torah tells us that if you're going to lend money to someone and you're going to take their night garment as security for the loan, return it to him before sunset. You can hold on to it all day long, but they need it back at night. Makes sense, right? It's obvious that if you take somebody's pajamas as security, you're going to have to let him have it back to sleep with at night. So why does the Torah continue with the following? For this alone is his covering, the garment for his skin. With what shall he otherwise sleep? And therefore, if he cries out to me, I will listen because I am compassionate. Goodness, so much drama, so much fanfare, stating the obvious. What is the Torah looking to convey when telling me something that I can pretty much figure out by myself? And here you have a perfect example of how you might have a seemingly trivial law, but like everything else in the Torah, it's there to communicate a much bigger message. See, there's a flip side to the argument. Granted, this may be his only pair of pajamas. Otherwise, with what shall he sleep, says the Torah. But you might argue, why is that my problem? He borrowed money from me. He gave me his one pair of Prada printed silk pajamas as collateral. Why do I want to give it back to him at any point prior to the repayment of my loan? Isn't that how security works? Legally, I am 100% in my right. And that's why the Torah needs to elaborate here and tell me there's the letter of the law and there's going beyond the letter of the law. There's being right and there's being a mensch. In as much as what you say makes sense, tells us the Torah, step out of your shoes for a moment and put on his shoes. Empathize with him. There's a word that's sadly so lost in our world today. Many of us can sympathize, but how many of us truly empathize? Fiorello LaGuardia, famous former mayor of New York, after whom the airport, LaGuardia Airport, is named, was in fact Jewish. Not that he publicized it. He was happy to let many people think, with a name like Fiorello LaGuardia, that he was Italian. Unlike other politicians, he always looked to empathize with his townsfolk, especially first responders and the like. And he was renowned for riding in fire trucks with firefighters, joining police officers, taking orphan children to baseball games. And one particular cold night in January 1935, during the depths of the Great Depression, Mayor LaGuardia came to a night court in one of the poorest areas in the city. He told the judge, "Take the night off. I'm going to preside over the court." And a short time later, an old woman dressed in threadbare clothing stood before him on a charge of stealing a loaf of bread. "Did you steal the loaf of bread?" She said, "I did. My daughter was sick. My two grandchildren had been abandoned and they had nothing to eat. They were going to die from starvation if I didn't go and shoplift the loaf of bread to help my sick daughter and her two kids." LaGuardia turned to the shopkeeper and asked, "Given the circumstances, do you really still want to press charges?" And the shopkeeper says, "I feel really bad for the woman. But this is a bad neighborhood and this woman needs to be punished to set an example for everyone else. People need to know not to shoplift." Now, Mayor LaGuardia had a dilemma. Under the law, the woman was guilty. She would have to pay the consequences. But given her reason for committing the crime, all things considered, to punish her would also be an injustice. The textbook penalty for shoplifting was $10 or 10 days in jail. What would you do if you were the judge? Well, you want to know what he did? He fined the woman $10. Justice is justice, he claimed. A thief has to be fined. But then he did something which stunned everybody there. LaGuardia took out a $10 bill from his wallet, gave it to the woman to pay her fine. Then he looked around the crowded, bustling courtroom and fined everybody there 50 cents for living in a city in which a grandmother had to steal a loaf of bread to feed her grandchildren. He directed the bailiff to collect the fines and hand the money to the defendant. The total collected came to $47.50, including the 50 cents willingly paid by the shopkeeper himself. The poor woman who was led to court to face charges is overwhelmed. She just received a gift of $47.50, and everyone had paid the fine. They gave Mayor LaGuardia a standing ovation. What does the story tell me? The same thing. Legally, he didn't have to do so. He could have enforced the law, as the book says, but like the Torah is telling the lender in our case, I need you to experience for a few moments the end result. This is his only garment. You can take it from him. You can claim you're right. It's security. But the bottom line is, with what then shall he sleep? You could take away his garment. You can keep it overnight. It's your legal right. But when the sun sets and you see that garment in your closet and you know that this borrower has nothing to sleep with tonight, will you be able to go to sleep? How relevant is this in our day and age? Think about it. You're having a disagreement with someone and you know you're 100% in the right. In fact, he or she knows it too, but sometimes you have to listen to those words. For this alone is his covering, the garment for his skin, with what shall he sleep? It doesn't mean you're wrong. It means that you and I must cultivate the art of empathy. I need to understand, I need to appreciate what this person is going through, even if they're wrong, even if they made the wrong decision, even if their behavior was irresponsible, even if they were negligent. It could all be true. And yet, before I make my final decision, consider one question. With what shall he sleep? What will this do for him or her? What will be the end result? What will I end up with, and what will they end up with? You know, in conflict resolution, it's rarely about right or wrong. He's right, she's wrong, or the other way around. That's not how you solve a problem. Empathy begins with understanding life from another person's perspective. Nobody has an objective experience of reality. It's all through our own individual prisms. It's about each seeing the other side and accepting that this is their reality, even if you don't see how anyone can live in such a reality. To be sure, it doesn't mean you allow other people to manipulate you. You have to protect yourself against that always. What it does mean is never, ever allow justice to blind you to the experience of another human being. Have the courage, the dignity, the self-esteem to consider the fate of another person, to consider the reality of another person, to consider the experience of another person, and make a decision, not from a place of justice, but by finding echoes of the other person's experience in your own heart and soul.